Today we're going to talk about the crumbling of the neoliberal order. What is the neoliberal order? And if it crumbles, is that a good thing or a bad thing? One of the things I end up talking about in a lot of videos is something known as the establishment. And understanding the definition that's kind of important to get the following concepts down. Interestingly, this is what AI thinks the American establishment looks like. Interesting, huh? Actually, when I told it to do, give me a sinister American establishment. So here we go. So first, what the establishment is not. The establishment is not some uh, conspiracy theory, super controlling secret organization that's in control of everything, that runs everything, blah, blah, blah. It's definitely not what it is at all. No. What the establishment is all the various interested parties that have some hand on the levers of power in America. And obviously, this includes the government, the bureaucracy, the banking system via the Federal Reserve, uh, the military to a lesser extent, military arms manufacturers, energy producers, other things like that. Anybody who Congress has to listen to, anyone who the bureaucracy has to listen to, is part of the establishment. And this can be just due to the fact they're in a position of power or they have the money to influence power. An influencer who can get their way is part of the establishment. So, the neoliberal order is an effort, and has been an effort, to create things like the UN, the World Trade Organization, and other quasi international organizations to create a system of rules for the world to work off of that transcends national governments. It embraces free trade and functions off the assumptions that the US is the preeminent naval power in the world and maintains open sea lanes for the world in exchange for US assuming control of the security affairs of other countries. The foundations of this were laid by international socialists and Marxists, to whom nationalism was considered an impediment to their movement. Uh, the foundations were also laid by progressives like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, who wanted to create a world order to spread the American progressive system throughout all nations as a joint effort between the British Empire and the US as a junior partner. And to a lesser extent, but it's important because they were successful, Jean Monnet, the father of the movement to create the European Union. The first major stab at the effort of creating a new order came from Wilson, uh, who engineered bringing the U.S. into World War I in order to secure a place at the treaty negotiations. Uh, his primary goal was to create the League of Nations, which would ultimately be a failure, but it was part of the thought process in terms of creating this new order. European establishments were still dominated by an empire mindset at the end of World War One, and they were too far out of sync with the ideas of the U.S. establishment to carry on a U.S. transnational vision. The U.S. establishment fractured on this idea of a transnational vision, as both the majority of the establishment and the populace felt they had been lied to and used by the European powers. The war for democracy ended up being a war to make empires bigger. FDR considered Wilson his mentor and picked up the torch of transnationalism. After his first two terms, he had enough time to plant like minded people in the US bureaucracy, which allowed them to use foreign policy to end round the nationalist elements of the US establishment. FDR's version of transnationalism differed from Wilson's, as he saw the empires of Europe to be too nationalist to join an international order. So US foreign policy was geared towards the dismemberment of the British and French empires. This was occurring in the lead up to World War II. FDR is frequently uh, painted as being a communist sympathizer, which I don't think is actually correct. A lot of his detractors use that because he was willing to try to use the communists to further his ideas. He saw the transnational nature of communism as being more malleable to his aims than the European empires. He assumed that China's civil war would be resolved in the favor of the nationalists, and that they would be more willing to side with the US on issues, since the US had been probably the least of all the nations mucking about in China's affairs prior to this. Thus, following World War II, the US became the new world leader. It sided with the two empires, France and Britain, which still had sizable holdings following World War II. And then, in between the two of them, the largest holdings of land and population on the planet. Then they added the Soviet Union, which was an equally large land power, and China as a repository of the world's biggest population. These powers were set up to be the force behind the UN Security Council, which the US believed they would be able to more or less keep control of, and the UN would act uh, as kind of a sounding place for the rest of the world. So the neoliberal order uses things like the UN, the World Bank, the WTO, and other uh, organizations such as that as proxies for its power, but it's not dependent on them. The New World Order was predicated on the idea that the US would provide security for nations and keep the sea lanes open in exchange for a Pax Americana. This is the neoliberal order. The various world organizations would act in a manner similar to what Madison had envisioned for the House of Representatives, what it ended up doing for the US government. That as being a place for the disgruntled to have a voice and blow off steam without disrupting the forward momentum of the establishment. Several things went really well. Because Western Europe was so completely destroyed and exhausted from World War II, they were pretty much fully willing to accept U.S. security dominance. So essentially, they bought into the deal completely. What didn't work was the Soviets proved to be a lot less agreeable than anticipated. Uh, the Chinese Civil War also did not turn out the way the planners at that time had envisioned. The Korean War was likely the blueprint for how things were intended to happen. The UN declares a security incident in a manner that the US establishment desires. The US places troops in without congressional oversight to assume the bulk of the workload, while other nations contribute a hodgepodge of support as a gesture. Interestingly, this precise model only got used once. The first Gulf War looked a little similar, but there was no attempt to create a UN military command. Uh, in fact, during the entire Korean War, the idea of a UN command was very prominent, and a lot of U.S. Newsreels would cover things as this being a UN effort. In fact, if you travel to Korea today, you will see elements of the uh, old UN command that ran the war. The duality issue of Euro-American West versus the communist East created an an alternate avenue for this new world order to work. Although the neoliberal order would occasionally topple critical governments in order to have pro-West governments in uh, key locations, they would mostly let governments in their spheres act as they wanted. Tolerance of very anti-liberal, regressive, and thuggish behavior was okay as long as the US had military access and market penetration. Who benefited? Well, American progressives, international socialist elements of the Western world, and American and European manufacturers. Okay, I think what we're going to do is break this up into several parts. Please smash the like button and go ahead and pick up in part two, where we probably will finish up some of the history and get into more modern times.